Right, everybody, and welcome to this amazing session. For those new and have not witnessed this program before, this program is titled New Politics and Afrofuturism, and it's basically calling on Black radical imagination and pop culture as powerful vehicle for propelling progressive social justice narratives to mainstream audiences with a focus on Afrofuturism, Black activism, and as well as political theory, climate justice, and political practice. And for those not familiar with the University of the Underground, University of the Underground is a free, pluralistic, and transnational university based in the basement of nightclubs in Amsterdam. But at the moment, as you see, it's having to go online. And it's headed up by Dr. Nelly Benayoun. And it gives me great pleasure, first and foremost, to welcome you all to this session entitled Climate Justice Now and How. I want to introduce our wonderful guest, and his name is Asad Rehman. He is the Executive Director of War on Want, and he's also a lifelong campaigner against racial injustice and economic justice. Asad has been at the forefront of the climate justice movement, both in the UK and globally, helping to reframe climate as an issue of racialized capitalism, economic and social injustice. And he's also co-convener of the Global Green New Deal project to connect the climate crisis, neoliberal inequality, COVID, and historical exploitation of the global South. He's by far the person who I like, in terms of people of color, like one of the probably the first to actually be campaigning in terms of the UK, from what I remember, from what I've seen anyway. So, and it's a real honor and a real joy to have you, Asad. Welcome, and I'll give the floor to you.
Thank you, brother, and thank you for the invitation, and thank you for giving up your evening to be on this call. So let me just first say something about War on Want, because maybe you haven't heard of War on Want. So we're a UK-based charity. Actually, we focus on the root causes of poverty, human rights violations. We were founded by the Labour movement back in the days of opposition to the war in Korea, hence its name. The only war worth fighting is the war against want, which is like a very English sentence. It comes from Mary Wollstonecraft and like radical feminists from the 18th century. And it was set up specifically to work directly with frontline communities and social movements and trade unions and workers' organizations. And so to this day, we support, amplify and work with, but at the same time, we also campaign and raise public awareness and build power in the UK about those root causes of poverty, inequality and injustice. And over the last sort of 65 years, War on Want's been pretty much at the forefront of many sort of leading movements. It was one of the few organizations that explicitly stood with an anti-colonial movements in the 60s. It supported the anti-imperialist struggles in the 70s and 80s, from everything from the struggles in Latin America to the national liberation struggles across Africa, across Asia. It was one of the first organizations to respond to the call of the South African people for boycott, divestment and sanctions. And today it's one of the very few charities or very few organizations that explicitly stands with the call of the Palestinian people for boycott, divestment and sanctions as well. And it's run all sorts of different campaigns. It was, was there very much at in the 80s within the anti-globalization movement, looking and understanding how, the politics of colonialism and imperialism had changed into globalization, why we needed to make interventions in terms around trade and finance and tax. It led the campaign and was one of the first advocates of the Tobin tax, the tax on currency speculation. And over the last 10 years has been within the UK context, and I'm sorry I'm going to keep mentioning the UK because just being located in the UK, I use the UK as an example. That is explicitly talks about neoliberal capitalism and isn't afraid to use the word capitalism as well in understanding how and what the structures are of injustice and inequality that exist. I was just before I popped on here, obviously looking at my Twitter and when you're looking at what's going on in the US and with the US elections, etc. And it just reminded me of this, of a quote that I don't rarely quote her because I usually quote movements of the global south, but I thought she had a very telling quote, which was Greta Sundberg, so the young Swedish climate justice activist. And I remember she made this speech to the US Congress or whatever last year now, and she said, "We need dreams. We cannot live without dreams, but there's a time and place for everything. And we are telling ourselves bedtime stories that soothe us and make us go back to sleep." And I thought that was really telling, because my experience, particularly in the climate justice, in the climate movement, and as Madge said, when I first got involved in the climate struggle, I was often the only non-white person, the person of color, anywhere in that movement. And and I used to say I'm a reluctant environmentalist. My entry point to that space wasn't because of environmentalism. It was because of my history of working in anti-racist struggles and working in global justice movements, and seeing that all of the things that we were fighting for were at risk and were being exacerbated by the climate crisis. And then being shocked at thinking, when I used to look at this climate, how people used to talk about climate change, obviously they would have that image of a white polar bear on a white iceberg, or if they ever talked about people of the global south, we were usually only ever pictured with our up to necks in water, with no agency, as if we had no political demands. And I thought, well, this is a place of struggle. And so really, in honor of all of those people and the millions of people who've been fighting for climate justice in the global south, I think one of our big challenges as progressive people is demanding we tell the truth, that we join the dots between the systemic exploitation of the poorest of the people of color in the world and the demands for climate justice. And, of course, we all know the truth is the majority of the people, they face multiple and compounding crises, right, at this moment. And each and every one of them amplifies all the existing economic, racial, and gender inequalities that exist in the world. Now, I would argue these are not just the results of decades of neoliberal policies, but actually form an arc of historical exploitation of people and resources that you can trace all the way back to the doctrine of discovery, to slavery, colonialism, imperialism, neoliberalism, climate crisis, even to the COVID-19 pandemic and the recession that we're seeing. And I say that, and you may have heard this term, that underpinning all of these things is this logic of racialized capitalism, which really, connects these systems of oppression that justify the sacrificing of Black, brown people and Indigenous people in the interest of profit. So part of what we've got to do, I think, is to be able to, we need to understand this if we're going to determine how we respond to this moment. And often, one of the things that happens in our movements and in these spaces is you see people who advocate, oh, well, we have to deal with one crisis at a time, and it's very strong in the environment and climate movement. We say, don't bring in issues of racial justice, don't bring in issues of economic justice or any other, we've got a fight on our hands. This is the biggest fight. It's a planetary fight. That's it. And of course, that's an illusion, but it's also a luxury that only people in the global north are able to contemplate. For most people in the global south, for people of color, indigenous communities, and increasingly for the poor in the global north, they face this permanent crisis of compounding and interconnected crises, poverty, racism, and exploitation, which denies the majority of the people, the majority of the world's citizens, the right to a dignified life. So if we want to be the advocates and we want to be able to intervene and address these crises, we clearly need not only a transformational vision, but an intersectional framework that can unpick all these common threads, identify what the critical interventions that we need to be able to guarantee that, and to be able to recognize the reality of the environmental limits that are imposed by the climate and crisis and ecological crisis. So for this moment, we could have just termed this talk, climate, COVID, capitalism, and everything else, right? I mean, all of these things are interconnected, but I think there are four profound crises that face us at this moment. There, of course, is the climate and ecological crisis. There is the existing crisis of inequality. And then, of course, there's the COVID-19 health pandemic and the recession. And then you've got this racialized capitalism, and I would link that with the mantra of economic growth that sustains these systems of oppression. So to start off, I think we should all know the truth and whose truth we tell in these crises. And I remember when I first entered the environment movement, and I tried to raise these issues, and I was often told, hey, we're all on this, we're all on the Titanic together, and it's hit the proverbial iceberg, right? This idea that, you're bringing in other perspectives, we're all on it, and it's literally, all hands on deck. And I'd say, actually, that's not the reality. It's true, we are all on the Titanic, but the citizens of the North, the rich and the elite, they're on the deck of the Titanic. They're still sipping champagne and cocktails, listening to the orchestra, thinking there's going to be some miraculous technological answer. And in the hold of the Titanic, it's black, brown people, people of color, indigenous people, it's the people of the global South, and they're already drowning. And when they try and escape, they find that hold is locked shut. So, before we begin this discussion, I was asking Majid, how much everybody knew. And of course, you don't need to be a climate scientist now to know the reality of the climate crisis. You look around the world, killer floods, droughts, famines, they're ravaging the world at a scale that we were told would only occur if we breached the 2-degree guardrail. And this is all happening at just over 1 degree. And you may remember in 2018, this report came out about, the warning about we can't breach the 1.5 degree. And it talked about, how it would destabilize the climate, that we would trigger feedback loops that were going beyond our control. And it's an incredible report because it sets out like what the impacts would be at a regional level as well, for people who are interested in like what would the impact be in across the continent of Africa or in Asia. It sets all those out, and it talks about the collapse in food production, the increase in water stress, more frequent and violent extreme weather events. Sorry, my kitten is clawing her way up my leg every moment. It's like, why are you ignoring me? More frequent and violent extreme weather events, and of course, devastating impacts on the economies of the global South that would far outweigh and dwarf that of the financial crisis. And, we can see that, just that, of how these issues combine together, and the increasing costs of this climate violence, and how countries in the global South are unable to deal with these economic losses. If you remember last year, and it feels like before COVID, feels like an age ago, but if you remember last year when Mozambique was hit by 2 cyclones, right? It destroyed 90% of its major port city, and it plunged 1 million people into hunger. Now, the reason why 1 million people were on the brink of hunger was not because of the cyclone. It was because Mozambique as a country was unable to meet the needs of its own citizens and be able to respond. So much so that Mozambique had to come to the City of London and beg for more debt-creating loans to be able to feed its own country, for its own citizens. And we can look at Mozambique and you say, how is it that been the case? How is it that Mozambique has been hollowed out as a functioning state? And we can say that's because of decades of conflict, much of it sponsored by the West, right? Its economy has been forced to rely totally on export-driven commodities. And when those prices collapse, its debt burden increases, and it's unable to provide even the most basic of services to its people. And as the corona pandemic spreads through the continent of Africa, we see the reality of what that would mean in Mozambique, which has 1 intensive care bed for the whole of its citizens, right? And of course, these multiple crises aren't a new reality. Just a little while ago, we saw a recent cyclone in Bangladesh, India. We've got a swarm of locusts across the Horn of Africa. We've had floods in Sudan. Last summer, India's 5th biggest city, Chennai, ran out of fresh water, and it's now predicted 40% of India's 1.2 billion people will be without access to fresh water in the coming decades. And you look at the Caribbean, Dominica, which was hit by just one storm, and it wiped out the equivalent of 240% of its GDP. That was one storm, and that's like every road, every school, every hospital, all hit by this. So this existential climate crisis that, isn't existential for people in the global South. And one of the most, thing that really pisses me off is when I hear people talk about climate change as we have to act on climate change because it's for our sake of our children or our grandchildren, you know, as if the lives of the people already dying and in the global south aren't worth it, you know, that we're doing this for there in the future and the reality there. And, you know, and this is no longer hyperbole from activists, right? There's an amazing report that you should all look at. It's by the UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. He issued a report where he talked about, and he used the word, we are creating a climate apartheid, where the rich are going to be able to seek safety and they will leave the poor to die from extreme weather, from hunger and heat. I mean, incredible, right? You have a UN Special Rapporteur using the word, we have created a climate apartheid, and that's the reality. And all of these existing inequalities of our economic systems, as we know, reinforce all of the unequal structures in the global economy. And they're all prefaced on, of course, condemning the poorest and most vulnerable in the global south to injustice. And you know, I'm talked about climate, we could talk about the ecosystems, you look at the ecosystems, all the critical ecosystems, the danger is equally apparent. Soil being destroyed, water shortages leaving millions of people without access to clean water, fish stocks on which 1 billion people rely on as their main source of protein are plummeting. Of course, we can talk about pollution in our oceans. We can talk about biodiversity disappearing at such an array that we're now talking about that this is the 6th great extinction. We're entering the 6th great extinction. And it's not just that this is about the globalized production, all the actions of elites, all the industrial capitalist system of extraction that's responsible. It's actually also that what's happened and what capitalism has done is disconnected people from their natural world, apart from, of course, the exception of frontline communities and indigenous communities. So much so that, you know, the idea of rational and ethical choices regarding the planet and its people are just ignored within this framework that we've created of political decision making. And I'm often told, you know, when you talk about the crisis, you know, I'm often told, well, if it's so serious, why aren't governments just acting rationally, right? Surely you present all this evidence to them, we're on this planetary crisis, an emergency, and then they would make rational choices. But you look back at history and you see countless civilizations have collapsed despite possessing all of the know-how to resolve their crisis. Then you're the technological, the cultural. And the problem is never that they don't understand the threat or the way to avert it. The problem is that social elites benefit so much from the system's dysfunction that they prevent all the available solutions from being put into place. And there's an amazing study that was done in the US, which said, where they looked at 1,800 policy decisions between 1981 and 2002. And they worked out that the overwhelming majority benefited the economic elites and corporations, whilst the general public had absolutely no independent influence at all on it. And there is a whole discussion we could have about, you know, this notion of sacrifice zones and how it's really connected to the politics of environmental racism. And it's and I think for Black activists particularly, it's really useful to know how that notion of sacrifice zones and environmental racism, which was developed in the US, is gone beyond geographical places to be a permanent reality for so many people. Now, of course, you know, this hasn't been news to people on the front line because they're already losing their lives and livelihoods. But it did send a shock through rich country societies. And so we saw Extinction Rebellion, we saw Fridays for the Future, we saw the youth climate strikes. It spelled all of these movements to come to the fore. But there's something I want to say about the climate science, and we should, as Black people and as activists, and I say Black as a political term that encompasses all people of color, say very quickly about the climate science because it's really important. 11 years ago, I was at Copenhagen with the climate talks, the the big infamous climate summit that took place. And there, rich countries and overwhelmingly the northern NGOs were calling for this 2-degree target, right? That our emissions shouldn't breach the 2-degree target. While climate justice movements from the global south were saying demanded temperatures kept below 1 degree. They were already saying, look, we're already dying. You could see it in displacement of people, in collapses of food, and what is happening. And having spent a decade at the climate talks, and sat in countless meetings with both NGOs and governments. And I have to tell you that often, as I said, I'd be the only person of color in the room. I couldn't tell the difference between the NGOs and the governments. People look the same, they talk the same, they dress the same, they even socialize together, you know, and they were just locked into this framework of, we have to be pragmatic in this face of this crisis. And what they mean by pragmatic, of course, is how can we protect the current economic system, and what do we calculate as an acceptable level of sacrifice? And to be honest, in Europe, many European decision makers were already calculating that they could survive a 2-degree warming of the planet. They could survive a 2.5-degree. Yes, it would have impacts. Yes, it would mean certain, you know, sea level rises, but that they would still be able to adapt to it. And they were calculating that the cost of what was happening into the global south was, compared to the cost of changing their economies, forget that. That was a willing sacrifice to make. And so when it came to, you know, in Paris, in this climate agreement, this Paris agreement that happened, you know, there was a slogan that was said there as our movements, climate justice movements. And some people say 1.5 to stay alive. And we used to say, no, 1.5 to barely stay alive. Because that, even that 1.5-degree goal is not safe, because nobody understands what the impact of breaching the 1.5 is going to be. They know it's going to be disastrous. They know it can trigger instabilities in everything from the Greenland ice sheet to the Antarctic ice sheet. They know it's going to compromise food sovereignty for millions of people. They know it's going to affect the Asian monsoon, which will affect the food production of 1 billion people. They know it'll erode biodiversity and pass all of these, trigger all of these feedbacks. And just a reminder, when you were at 1.5, we're halfway to what the opposite of an ice age is, right? So the ice age was 3 degrees below from where we are. Where we are heading is 1.5. So sometimes we get fooled by these numbers because they look so small. What does 1.5 mean when I want to go on holiday and I'm in freezing Europe and I look for, like, you know, to be in at 25 degree and in warm countries, etc. The reality, of course, is we're talking about an average. And when we talk about what the impact in places across the continent of Africa is, for every 1 degree, we're talking about 8-9 degrees warming in tropical areas and in the global south. I'm sorry, I'm going to bore you with some facts about the carbon budget. Now, climate scientists said to keep temperatures below 1.5, we would need to decline by about 25 gigatons of CO2 by 2030. Currently, all the Paris agreements, all the targets that are in the Paris Agreement are going to lead to at least 55 gigatons of CO2, above 55 by 2030. So we're faced with, we know we have to be at minus 25 where we are, yet we're heading at 55. That's just how different we are in the realities. And even that carbon budget, which is about 350 gigatons that are left, you know, that's calculated at 1 in 3 chance of failing. Now, none of us would get in any building, any bus, any train if they said there's a 1 in 3 chance of this crashing, right? And you dying. But that is what policymakers are calculating. They're calculating, of course, because again, this logic of sacrificing the global south. So really, there is absolutely no safe carbon budget anymore. Now, despite all of the evidence, and since 1990, there's been countless evidence, what we've seen is actually annual global emissions have grown by 60%, you know, and we've doubled the total global cumulative emissions. Now, some of you might see in this very, very famous champagne glass, climate champagne glass. Have you seen this climate champagne glass? It's this champagne glass about emissions, yeah? You know, the richest 10% of the world are responsible for 50% of emissions. The poorest 50% of the world are only responsible for 10% of emissions. half of all the total growth in all absolute emissions are down to that richest 10%. And of that richest 5%, they're responsible for about 37%, whilst the poorest half of the world are responsible for less than 7% of all of the growth in emissions. And so much so now that the top 1% of the world, which is overwhelmingly citizens in the global north, are now responsible for double the emissions of the poorest 50%. That's double the emissions of 3.5 billion people in the world. That's how the extreme inequalities that sit within that carbon budget. And, you know, for us as social justice activists, we should never allow that champagne glass to be seen in isolation. What we should be putting alongside it is the champagne glass of inequality. And when you see the champagne glass of inequality, you see an exact similar story. You see that the richest half, 10% of the world, you know, have the overwhelming majority of global wealth. The poorest 50% of the world, you know, have only 2% of global wealth. We have a situation where 3.5 billion people in this world live on less than $5 a day. 2 billion people are going hungry. We have 1 billion people without access to fresh water, about 1.6 billion people without adequate housing, and I could go on and on and on. And, you know, when you overlay all of these and you overlay them where these impacts are happening, you see a similar story, that the responsibility is in the global north and the impacts are happening overwhelmingly in the global south. You know, you do it for COVID and its impacts, you can do it for climate, you can do it for neoliberal inequality, you can do it for exploitation of resources. Every single graph tells you exactly the same story. And I say that because, you know, sometimes people say, well, inequality shows that this economic system is failing. And I say, no, it doesn't. It shows that this economic system is working exactly as it was set up to do. It was set up to extract wealth from the poor to the rich. It was set up to exploit the resources of the global south to benefit the global north. And, you know, and a telling example, of course, is even during COVID and the lockdown, right? The wealth of the richest has increased by 1/3, whilst, you know, people were tweeting in the global north, you know, I'm sure you might remember over the summer, nature is recovering, you know, and pictures of deers and ducks in cities at the very same time as, you know, thousands of migrant workers were walking destitute for safety across India, where the dead were lying unburied in Ecuador, where countless people were left completely without any support. So, you know, there is a reason why somebody like Jeff Bezos, who's worth 189 billion, you know, and makes 250 million each and every day, you know, why he is able to amass that wealth. And just to give you there's a lot of very, very good sort of stats that people work around that, you know, that if somebody was paid $5,000 from each and every day from when Columbus went to discover what was never lost, you know, they'd still not be a billionaire. But what strikes me is particularly for us, for people of color who are overwhelmingly in the jobs in these retail sectors, you know, that an Amazon worker on an average minimum wage would have to work 24 hours a day for 68 years just to earn what Bezos earns in 1 hour. Now, that's the reality of the extreme inequalities and that we see. So the reality is, if we were really being serious about a carbon budget for 1.5, we would say we've got less than 5 years. If we're being generous, we're saying it's a decade, 9 years, where literally every decision we make in this next decade will determine how many people of the global south are being sacrificed, how many lives and livelihoods will be destroyed. Now, that's quite an incredible challenge, right? Changing a fossil fuel economy, a capitalist economy, you know, in such a profound way. And of course, you know, that's where you see this, you know, disconnect between the discussions that you see from mainstream NGOs and policymakers about the kind of transformation that they want to do. So many of them have got literally are crossing their fingers, hoping that there's going to be some technological thing that will come online that's going to suck carbon out of the atmosphere, so allow them to pollute, is going to be able to allow us to breach 1.5, even breach 2 degrees, and then somehow turn the temperature back down. Sorry, she's walking across the keyboard and probably making lots of noise. And nobody knows that if you can actually ever turn back the temperature. What we do know is the only technology that exists is this technology called bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. The only one. It requires 3 times the landmass of India. Where is there a continent 3 times the landmass of India sitting where nobody's, what we know is the reality is that, you know, it will be the land of land that the majority of the world's citizens rely on. And you probably all know, right? 80% of the world's population is fed, right, by agroecology and small farmer. Guess on how much land? 24% of land. In places in Africa, it's down to 11%. The majority of other agricultural land, it's all used for exports to the global north. It's all for export commodities to the global north. Why? Because we've constructed a global economy which has determined that. Now, I want to just, sorry, how much longer have I got, Majid?
Yeah, like you've got another like 10 minutes.
Okay, I'm going to race through. Look, we all know Corona, right? The Corona pandemic's been this X-ray on our societies, right? Exposed all the deep racial, economic, gender inequalities. And we all know this is a result of decades of neoliberal policies, right? But of course, in the global, and that's happening in societies in the global north, we see that, right? The death rates of who's dying, who's most impacted, who's facing the most extreme levels of poverty and inequality, who's trapped in low pay, all of those. But of course, for the global south, they have been the hardest hit because they have lack of access to social protection, any safe and secure work, decent housing, and all the existing health inequalities that make the poorest most vulnerable to this crisis. Now, you know, we're at a scale where we're close to whatever, over 40 million people cases. We're over 1 million dead and countless more hospitalized. And of course, with many with life-changing illnesses. And yet we have not really seen the penetration of the coronavirus properly into many parts of the global south. We're only beginning to see the first wave now in many countries in the global south. And you can see from the rise in cases across Latin America. Now, in the global north, you know, what did our countries do? What did our governments do? They upended a decade of austerity, right? They ripped up their neoliberal rule book. They said, we're going to intervene in our economies. We're going to protect our citizens and our economy. We're going to invest in public services. Now, they might have done it badly, but they did do it. They did say, at the very same time, countries in the global south had not one of those tools to be able to use to protect their own citizens, right? Now, you know, there's an average in Europe where we talk about 24 doctors per 10,000 people. Right, that's the average of doctors. In places like Sierra Leone and Burkina Faso, etc., it's not just 1 doctor per 10,000, it's 0.01 doctor per 10,000. Why? Because the structural adjustment programs that the IMF insisted on countries across the global south and particularly across Africa, they said you have to reduce your public service, your public sector. You have to privatize your health systems. You have to privatize your education system. The very things that all of us now know we rely on to be able to be secure in this pandemic are the very same things that our economic system and capitalism has ripped away from the ability of countries in the global south. Why? Because, of course, neoliberalism demanded a few things. It said, we want a deregulated economy, we want privatization, we want a rollback of the state, and we want, of course, protection of corporations. And this latest manifestation of capitalism and the creation of this insecure work, I think is you know, people talk about disaster capitalism as being the next thing. Disaster capitalism is already here. Now, the scale of that and the impacts on the global south are way beyond anything that we saw with the 2008 financial crisis, right? And we could spend a lot of time talking about, you know, everything from the debt crisis that it's already happening for countries in the global south, to the reality of course, the rise of these right-wing and authoritarian governments, not just Trump, but Bolsonaro, Modi, Duterte, Orban, all, you know, have got this program of basically saying the way to resolve this the corona crisis and the ensuing global recession, right? And the ensuing global recession, the ILO already says, the International Labour Organization already says we've lost 420 million jobs as a result of this crisis. And it's estimated that up to half of all jobs in the global south are at risk. And remember, in the global south, 70% of all people who work are working in the informal economy. That's without any means of social protection, any means of secure work. Only 30% are in what is called the formal economy. And of those 30%, half of all of those jobs are liable to go. So the scale of this crisis of inequality and the impacts of the recession are huge. Now, so much to say, you know, even with the, you know, even with the corona pandemic, which, you know, some people in the environment movement have said, you know, the corona pandemic is like a curtain raiser to climate change. It shows that, you know, there's this global crisis that we have to respond to globally. And I looked and I was like, I don't see a global response. What I saw was rich countries competing with poor countries for vital PPE equipment, you know, poor countries who the IMF, not the most revolutionary of organizations, said poorer countries in the global south needed $2.2 trillion just to deal with the impacts of the health pandemic. And rich countries of the global north said, we're sorry, we're busy, we're redirecting all of our money towards our own domestic economies. We're not even going to have a global meeting about the corona pandemic, and they're going to have that in the G20 in November. That's the first time that the richest countries in the world will begin to meet. Of the 2.2 trillion that was needed, we have had a drop in the ocean. So if the corona pandemic is the curtain raiser to the climate crisis, to me, it just shows one thing. It shows that the people of the global south will be left to fend for themselves, and citizens and economies of the global north will look and protect themselves. And that's why often there's a narrative in the global north, in the environment movement, which we have to always counter, which is this discussion about, well, we have to look within our own nation state. We have to look about greening our economy only within our nation state, and ignoring the reality that, you know, the greening of the economy in the north, it's only possible if you carry on the same logic of extractivism and racialized capitalism that has existed. Because the answer is not going to be found in electric batteries, right? It's no way. You cannot meet energy demands by electric batteries. The reality is we need to reduce energy consumption by about 60%, whilst about 60% of the world, the 3.5 billion people who don't have access to electricity or clean cooking, want energy. The only way to be able to do that is to have a much more profound conversation about energy, to be able to say what energy is a public good, what is productive energy, how much energy should everybody have, how do we build sustainable energy systems that don't rely on a massive wave, a new wave of extraction. And just to say the scale of extraction that is already planned. At the moment, the world, it's calculated, the world has about 50 billion tons of materials that are sustainable, that you can extract each and every year. We're at about 80 something at the moment, and we're predicted to go to 150 in the next decade. So we're going to double the amount of extraction overwhelmingly from the global south, with huge environmental injustices, with displacement of people, with water pollution, with destroying of communities, overwhelmingly under the name of the green recovery or green capitalism. Now, if I've got a few minutes, I just wanted to draw back and just tell and just talk about this politics of sacrifice in the global south, because it's the story of the economy, not just of the UK, but all rich developed countries. And I don't know where everybody's, where you are across Europe or where you're in, but it is the story of the global north. And you know, there's a reason why the UK is the 6th richest economy in the world. And like I said, I'm apologizing for using the UK. And that's as an example. That's not because the UK was some particularly, you know, ingenious or inventive or had this amazing intelligence. It's because Britain was a singularly efficient and brutal engine of imperial exploitation of resources of both people and wealth of the global south. And as I said, you can trace that back to doctrine of discovery, but we can just talk for a moment about how slavery financed and set the scene for England's industrial revolution. It's calculated between 1761 and 1808, British traders were responsible for enslaving 1.5 million people of African descent and taking them across the Atlantic. And they pocketed what would be the equivalent of £8 billion in today's money. And then, of course, they set up the slave colonies that supplied the UK with sugar, tobacco, coffee, chocolate, cotton, all of those things. And I say that because, it's interesting in the height of so-called Britain's industrial revolution, it was calculated that £4 million was being invested into the economy each and every year. Of that 4 million, 3.8 million came from slave-based commercial profits. I mean, you literally can say that every brick and mortar, the roads, the canals, the universities, the banks, the Barclays Bank, which was founded by profits from slavery, to the Bank of England, to even the experiments of people like James Watt, who's the inventor of the steam engine, were all financed by slavery. And that exploitation of, slavery is, of course, continued not just when slavery was so-called abolished in the UK. And you all probably have heard that when slavery was abolished, compensation and reparations were not paid to any of the people who were enslaved. In fact, 40% of the UK's national budget went to the wealthiest families, a debt that the UK taxpayers only finished paying off in 2015. And that investment continued to enrich those wealthiest families who were the most responsible for slavery, and then became the champions of course, the British economy. So the bricks and mortars are there, and it's 500 years of that looting of resources. And I said slavery, I could talk about colonialism. I'm going to finish quite quickly, Majid, right? I'm originally from Pakistan and in the Indian subcontinent, and it's calculated that Britain, during just the Raj in India, just from India alone, looted $45 trillion between 1765 and 1938. To put that into perspective, that's 17 times more than the total GDP of the UK. The reality is the global South has built the global North, right? And that's not about being the past. And of course, that's just about India. What they took from the continent of Africa, from the Caribbean, or from anywhere else. It's said that Britain never spent a single penny of its own money on its expansion into Canada, Australia, on the new colonies. It never spent a single penny of its own money on the expansion of capitalism. It never spent a single penny on any of its conflict. All of that money came from the global South. You could say that the global South built the global North. And, please look at, I'm sure in these, you probably read Walter Rodney's incredible seminal book on how Europe underdeveloped Africa, how it was a conscious decision, how it was a deliberate impoverishment of the African continent, and he talks about that there's a link between the colonization of Africa and other parts of the world in this chain of events, which makes it possible for this transformation of the base of European capitalism. And one thing you should, if you ever get a moment to do, is you look at a map of Africa under the colonial regimes, and then look at the commodities, and then look at a map today and look at the commodities, and it's exactly the same. It's exactly the same commodities going from the same places, going to the global North. We, as War on Want, we did a calculation that just in the city of London, there's 101 companies in Britain that own over £1 trillion worth of mineral wealth of Africa. That's more than the entire GDP of every sub-Saharan African country put together. And I say that because we're in this moment of neocolonialism. And of course, this has only been possible because of this period of imperialism, of the overthrow of Lumumba in Congo, of Mossadegh in Iran, of Allende in Chile. And it's amazing that, of course, that the Chilean people's protests are going to overthrow now and rewrite the neoliberal constitution. But all of these people were overthrown for one simple reason, because they argued against the power of Western multinationals, against the power of export commodities. They wanted to build economies that were about their own people, and they wanted to build and invest in health, education. You look at the national programs of all of these leaders, they're about building the sustainability and of their economy for their citizens. All the vital things that are needed to face the COVID pandemic, the climate crisis, and the inequality crisis. And of course, look, I'm going to just end with this one last thing. You know, people in the global north often say, well, the answer to that is more money, right? We should just give some more aid, right? Look, since 2012, developing countries in the global south, they've received about 1.3 trillion. And that includes all aid, all investment, and all income, including remittances from workers in the global north back to their families. At the same time, 3.3 trillion flowed from the global south to the global north. So when I talk about slavery and colonialism extraction, those are not past historic things. To this day, it's calculated for every $1 that flows to the global south, $24 flows back to the global north. And that's because, of course, of the power of corporations taking their capital flows back to the global north. We talk about the unfair trade deals. We talk about the 4.6 trillion that the global south has paid in unsustainable debt repayments. And of course, the illicit tax flows that go to the tax havens that the majority of the global north, including the UK, does. So the answer is not going to be in terms of, you know, we should give more finance. That's why we did a fundamental reordering of our global economy, which is why, whether you're talking climate, COVID, inequality, or racialized capitalism, we have to talk about a new way. And that means we can't allow the climate crisis to be talked only about energy. We have to say, we have to guarantee people a living wage, guaranteed social protection, basic income, universal public services, because they are the most critical measures that you need. When you look at the climate impacts or inequality impacts that happen on the global south, what determines whether you live or die, what determines whether you're displaced from your home, is whether you have income, whether you have services, whether you have access to food and energy. We have to have a much more profound conversation that connects these economic justice issues with the climate justice demands, and then put them into a vision that actually is compelling. Because I'm just going to end with this last sentence. You may remember a year ago, whatever ago, it feels like an age ago, the Gilets jaunes, the yellow vests in France, had a protest against the carbon tax. And they had a banner, which I thought, you know, that picture of that banner should be in every fucking environment office in this bloody thing. And it said, the elites worry about the end of the world. We ordinary people, we worry about the end of the month. And for us, that question is about, how do you build social license for the transformation? It's not possible to say to people with nothing, come for a vision of the future where they can't see themselves. You have to be able to answer people's immediate needs. You have to be able to connect our struggles of where we're fighting now with our vision for the future. We've done it before. Those have been the movements that have created profound change. They overthrew colonialism and imperialism. It's now our job here in the global north to support our movements in the global south in that vision. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that, Asad. That was truly, and I'm sure many people can listen to you all day. So thank you so much. I'm going to go straight into questions. I know, Eduardo, and over to you, but if you want to take yourself off mute.
Yeah, I mean, I don't want to just refer to energy. First of all, I think the talk was amazing. Thank you so much, Asad. I really enjoyed it. I've been researching a lot around all these different topics, so it's very familiar to me. And I agree with everything you said, which leads us to the question of how we do that. How do we end with capitalism, right? Because at some point, I think it's something that is beyond our control, in my opinion. Anyway, we can discuss about that if you want, but I had like a specific question which was referred to, okay, if we want to look for other kind of model and like models of energy, what happened with nuclear, or what is your idea about nuclear, or what are the alternatives to carbon?
Okay, so look, whether you are are pro-nuclear or anti-nuclear. And of course, there are very strong arguments being anti-nuclear for a whole number of other reasons, right, in terms of about nuclear power. The reality is, when you take the carbon budget, we don't have 30 years. That's how long it takes for nuclear to come online. And it's still, nuclear doesn't provide energy for the majority of the world's citizens. What we need, and there's an amazing report, and I'll put it in the link, which shows that we can provide energy and we can provide a dignified life, i.e. everything from health, education, all the things that people will need, including the ability to be able to travel, on sustain for 10 billion people. But what it means is you have to reduce the consumption of energy that is what I would say unproductive. So that talks about, what parts of our economy are creating things that we just don't need, So I think it's a question in terms of, if you simply look at it from energy terms, the answer is decentralized energy systems. They're the localized energy systems. But the more profound change of the energy system, which underpins capitalism, I think is changing the conversation of energy away from carbon to changing the conversation around energy as a public good. That's what I think. Sorry. I don't know if Eduardo that answered. I mean, there's, that. So I take both a pragmatic and an ideological view. That, to me, nuclear isn't the answer for people in the global south. If we really wanted to talk about it, we'd be talking about investing in community-owned energy.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you. From my point of view, is the resolution, or in which you approach to these topics. Like, of course, that will be, in my opinion, like necessary, and that will be like the best case scenario. But but while we keep saying this, and while we keep doing this, carbon is emitted to the atmosphere. Right now, there is no way, and I've been researching about this for a long time, no way we reach the 1.5 degree. I mean, we are beyond that already, almost beyond that. Like, there is no way we are with those IPCC models. Even to arrive to the 1.5, it demands not only the use of reorganization of other kind of sequestration systems, but also the active using of CCS. I mean, like, it's not. I don't think this has like just one solution. This is the magic solution you have to apply. You have like a lot of different tools that at some point they are going to play a role on it, from my point of view. And in that sense, my opinion of nuclear is it's not something I would like to use, but in difference of carbon, which is, I mean, the problem of all this is waste, right? The carbon that we put in the atmosphere is a waste, in the same way that nuclear waste, right? But in the opposite of nuclear waste, which is concrete, defined, where it is, and it represents like someone has to take responsibility to deal with that waste, right? The other, which is carbon waste that we put in the atmosphere, no one has to take responsibility for that. It is dispersed up there, and so we can't forget about it. It's very difficult to say, hey, this is your part, this is your part. So we have that problem of not in my backyard thing, right? Like, not go to nuclear because someone has to take responsibility for it. Okay, so let's keep, burning coal and burning fossil fuels because we don't have to take responsibility for that. And in my point, what that represents is that we also don't have like, like new governance models that take into account like long-termism models of energy. Like, okay, if we are going to use this energy, means that we have to create like a span of responsibility to what that energy represents and means for a very, very long time, not only, a lifespan of 1 generation or 3 generations.
Sure. So look, often I think in the global north, people are talking about, generation and distribution, right? And say, okay, if we can generate differently and we can distribute, and those are important. But I think the other question is about extraction, right? Now, we are on known reserves, known fossil fuel reserves that are licensed to, the companies are going to extract. We all know it's going to burn the planet 3 times, or we'll bust today. And we are still investing, since Paris, 1.4 trillion has been invested into exploring new fossil fuel reserves, right? So my worry is that what nuclear does is not displace, it simply adds. And so to shift that logic of energy, you have to start saying it's about how do we cap how much extraction of energy, and then we start to say how do we use, and I think that's a more profound conversation about energy has to be seen as a public good. So I agree with you, there's no one silver bullet, but for us, and I agree with you also about the 1.5. I tell you, you know, anybody who works on climate is used to a lot of doom, and you read and you're like shit scared all the time. And what gets me up every morning is we are fighting about each 0.1 degree of warming and putting it as in, this is the scale of people, of our people who will die. So every limit we put, if even 0.1 has an immense impact on the lives and livelihoods of millions of people. And so where we end up stopping temperature level, God knows. And we have to also fight in then for the adaptive measures to be able to protect our people. So we have.
Oh, it's frozen, or is it me?
Yeah, it's also for me.
He was that passionate. He made himself.
He broke the internet.
If he's still here, are you with us, Asad? Eduardo, he's gone now.
Yeah.
No, sorry. See, even in the
there you are.
bloody stable Wi-Fi, right? Because
Sorry.
look, all I'm going to say is just on that, the question about, you know, the carbon budget and where we end up and how we at the same time fight for adaptive measures. Now, this looks beyond us at points, and people do say, God, that's just such an immense change. And a year ago, when I used to argue this, people say it's not possible. Then look what's happened with Corona. Just look what's happened. Look at the possibility of this moment has brought. This is a crisis of capitalism that cannot be solved by recapitalizing the banks like they did in 2008. This is a fundamental fissure in capitalism. What comes next is either something that's more sustainable, and our fight is that, or a more extreme version of disaster capitalism. And so I think the window of opportunity for actually radical transformation demands exists in a way that it has never existed in the scale and this moment. And the other positive thing is when you look around, you look from the Black Lives Matter to the climate strikers to you see there is a growing movement of people in the global north, because it was there in the global south, right? Before COVID, I know January feels like a long time, but remember January? Chile, millions of people on the streets, but Sudan, Algeria, Lebanon, Iraq, all around the world, people were protesting about inequality and injustice. They were talking not about we want to end, they were talking for structural changes. That is going to get worse with COVID. And in that, there's a possibility of movements in the global south rising in a way that I don't think we'll have seen since the last 30 years. And if they can combine with radical movements in the global north, maybe there's a possibility of profound change. So I'm an optimist.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And I think there was a question from April. Do you want to ask your question, April?
Yeah, sorry. It's like three-tonged question. Hold on a sec. The first question, yeah, I think you've kind of covered the first half as like started providing some solutions. I just needed some sort of optimism. And then like so basically my question would be, it's kind of a UK centric question because I'm from England, but obviously recently the Tories have basically banned teaching any anti-capitalist materials in school, and it looks like they're sort of aware that there's this huge movement evolving and doing whatever they can to try and suppress it by like defunding the arts and everything like that. I just wondered if you knew any movements or anything that's going against that, because I feel like it's completely illegal. And then my other question was like, who do you trust in positions of power right now?
So on the first point, just I'm just going to. There's actually a bunch of very great, amazing, radical activists taking a judicial review against the government on that.
Just searching for that link, and I'll share it in
material.
the group.
Yeah, so Ilyas and all of that, they're doing
that's right.
amazing work in terms of, yeah. So there are some people you should connect with. I just want to say something about hope, you know, because often we're told that, you know, hope is not something we should have. And you might tell from my accent, well, those of you in England might tell from my accent, I'm originally from Lancashire. And I want to just tell you a story. During the American Civil War, right? During the American Civil War, there was an embargo on the southern states to prevent them from, you know, exporting cotton. And, you know, of course, to finance their part of the war. And the merchants in Liverpool paid for and built a warship to break the blockade and to allow cotton to come from the southern slaves plantations to the UK. And in the UK, in Lancashire and parts of Yorkshire, there was this thing called the cotton famine, because no cotton was coming in. The people were destitute. The mills were shut down, and cotton came to Rochdale. And the workers in 1770, the workers who were destitute refused to handle the cotton. They said, we have solidarity with people, with the slaves and their struggle in the southern states. There is incredible, and the whole history of humanity is got these amazing stories of where and how solidarity has been built and hope has been given. So I think we should always be immensely hopeful, because we have taken on the powers at each and every stage. Everything we've ever won has come because of struggle. So we should never forget that power of people in terms of in struggle. Then the third point you were saying was at the, I forgot, April, sorry. The
So
third
it's just who do you trust currently in positions of power?
So I think there's a thing about, we should never put hope in people in political power, in the sense of just putting hope in them. People in political power, positions of power, respond to how powerful our movements are. The more powerful our movements are, the more we're able to hold people accountable, the more we're able to shift the agenda. And I'll just make a comment about, you know, the Corbynista moment in the UK. I think too many people thought, well, Jeremy's there, he's lovely, let's get Jeremy elected, everything will be all right. Where what we needed to do was to have a movement that was way beyond Jeremy, that was building the license and the power. And then you get your political leaders to be following that movement, not to be the vanguard of that movement. And that, I think, has been, anywhere there's been successful people in power, have been there. Look, I have immense respect for, you know, for Majid when he was in at the European Parliament, for Caroline Lucas, you know, for Jeremy, for John McDonnell. There are amazing political people who are all, you know, dedicated their lives to the struggle, but they are not going to be our solution by themselves. It's really us. We're going to be the power, and it's how what the movements we build, and our challenge is to build this movement of movements. I think that's the most profound challenge. Too often we're forced into fighting in silo fights. Each movement fights itself, fights in its thing, and doesn't try to connect the issues. So, you know, Black Lives Matter, great, but there were parts of people saying, but we don't want to talk about anything else. And then there were part of the movement saying, you can't talk about this without talking about climate, you can't talk about that. And that's what we've got to do. We've got to knit together our story of the world and knit together our story of our movements.
Brilliant.
Thank you very much.
Is there any other questions from anyone else? Right, brilliant. And on that case, and Asad, thank you so much. There's been a lot of comments in the chat box of people, and we're absolutely, so thank you so much and for your time and everything. And yeah, if you want to get that. yeah, thank you so much for your time, Asad, and thanks to everyone else and for joining us. And how can people find out? Oh, yeah, there it is. And share Twitter as well as if anyone wants to search War and Want, but I'm sure this won't be the last time and we'll be hearing from you, Asad. But thank you so much, bro. Greatly appreciate it. And thanks for joining us, everyone. And have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. And thank you all for, listening to boring old me, and good luck with all of your struggles. And, and if feel free to drop me a note if there's any of this bit of information, like, oh, where did you get that from? More than happy to send you some links. And I know Majid was already doing that, but all power to you as well.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Take care.
Take care. Bye-bye.